welcome to a little tutorial on the Vector 8-track sequencer. Tonight I'm using it to do a cover of AFX Backdoor.Spyboter from Intellijel 08, released in 2005. The Vector is so deep that I'll only just touch on the basics here, but I'll include the amazing features of it, such as 2 sub-tracks per track, the way it can sequence 4 polyphonic drums on a single track, and the way it can play chords on a single track as well. Spyboter uses 3 tracks of SH-101, 2 tracks of TB-303, Juno string, and the TR-808 for the drums. So to get that sound, I'm using the G-Storm Electro SH-101 voice, the Atlantis, the Acidlab M303, and the 808 drums will come from the System 80-880, and the Juno pad coming from the Knobula Polycinematic. The first step is going to be to name it and save it. And as we go along, we can keep saving. So this black button here is the shift button. And you'll notice that there is text by a lot of these buttons that'll tell you the shift function of it. And you can see that the blue button here has the save text next to it. So shift and the part button gives you the opportunity to name it and save it by hitting the next button. So I'll call this Spybot. Now you can change the letters by using these encoders along here. So I need an S there. And then you hit next to save that. And you can see that there are 8 parts. That the word part just means track, but I think the reason the word is not track is because there are really 8 tracks with each with 2 sub-tracks. And those sub-tracks can be used to control the track. Like if you wanted your bass line to play twice and then go down 2 notes and play twice, come back up where it was, you can do that all on one track using the sub tracks. So it does make sense to call it a part, and we'll get into that. Next thing we'll do is set the tempo to 120, and we'll go under global, and you can see the BPM right there. By default it was 120, but that's where you set it. You can also adjust your swing there. Change where the sync message is coming from. Here it's internal. You can choose key and different scales, and the Vector does have some modes where it can write your bass line for you and things like that. And then this is where you turn on and off the playlist. Now what the playlist is the ability to chain patterns together. So now we're ready to put the bass line in for the G-Storm Electro SH-101 voice. Now I do have an SH-101, and I will say that the G-Storm Electro sounds exactly like my SH-101. If I hit part, you can see all 8 parts represented there, and by using the white keys I can select between the different parts and work on them. And you'll see here skip, mute, select. You can also mute different parts by using the white buttons now. Now you see them darkening. So during a performance, you could mute different parts. But being in the select mode, now I can select part 1. Now I'm working on part 1, which is going to be the bass line. And so I'll hit pitch. Now we can start entering the pitches. It's not really coming across on video, the light and dark notes here, but in person you can really see, you can really distinguish which gates are on. They're lit up, and then the other ones are darker. All you have to do is just click on the encoders and it turns the gates on for those steps. And in addition, I'm not going to get into it too much here, but I'll go ahead and show you a few of the other features. The ratchet, so By turning these, you can add ratchets. And there's also chants, and it's very sophisticated types of chants that you can add to it. So I'm not really getting into it in the Spyboter cover here. Trying to keep this more of a beginner video. Also, velocities available, and gate and groove, so you can move certain beats off of the main beat and get a lot more groove that way. As far as the gates, you can tie notes together so that you have like one long note playing across. So I know that the first notes that play in Spyboter are the E flat. I also know that it takes up 16 steps, like your typical TR-808 sequencer type of thing. You'd have 16 steps, but you're only seeing 8 here. And so how do you get the 16 steps? Well, you hit the control button, and you can see here, length. You can change the length to 16. Now, by default, it may be down on 8, so you have to change that to 16. But the way to see the second 8 steps is by hitting next. So now we're looking at step 9 through 16. It can go up to 64, and you would change that in the global section if you want to have 64 steps. Back to the pitch, they're all E flat on the first little measure here of Spyboter. The second measure of Spyboter, it's going to go down 2 semitones. So here's where I'll show you something I'm not going to use in Spyboter, but this is a really helpful thing on the Vector that I use all the time, is that, you know, in the past you would have to use a second track to transpose your track 1. Let's say you wanted track 1, in the case of Spyboter, to play twice, and then you wanted it to go down 2 semitones and play twice, and go back up and play twice. Well, in the past, you would have had to use maybe a second sequencer and a precision adder to do that type of thing, where you'd you would subtract voltage from it and make it go down the 2 semitones by subtracting some control voltage for a couple measures, and then add back in the control voltage, and it would make your pitch go up and down. But here we've got 2 separate subsequences that we can do things with, and we can also tell it the length and rate, so there's a little clock division there. With Spyboter, the bass line is not the same when it goes down. It has a different rhythm pattern. And so I can't really use this with Spyboter, but I'll show you how it works. So you'll enable it by turning the encoder, and we'll tell it that the parameter we want this subsequence to control is transposition. And if we hit modulation again, you can see the values of the transposition. Or we want it to be offset by 0, 0, so the original pattern plays twice. Then we want it to be offset once. We want it to go down 2 semitones, down 2 semitones, and repeat. Go back to where we were there. And so we want the length of it to be 4. And you also saw that the rate was too fast. So you see what the subsequencer is doing for us is transposing it for us, playing it twice, and then returning. But in Spyboter, the bass line is actually a different rhythm when it goes down the 2 semitones. So this was just to demonstrate how that might work. So for now, I'm going to turn that off again. So I'll go to enable, and just turn that off. What I'm going to do instead to transpose mine is that I'm going to go to preset. I'm going to duplicate the first pattern, and then I'm going to make changes to it. I'm going to take it down 2 semitones. But by using this preset, you can chain your patterns together and make them do that. And like Spyboter, have a different rhythm pattern to the bass line that goes down 2 semitones than what you had with the original. So you will copy that A01 pattern to A02 by hitting Shift, and then up here you see dupe written in a different text. So that indicates that it's one of these shift patterns. So when you hit Shift Dupe, it puts this pattern A02 in there. And then you can chain those 2 patterns together and tell it, how many times you want the first one to play, then how many times you want the one that's transposed to play. And the way you did that is when you're in this preset mode here, you hit the previous button. And that is where you can set up how many times each pattern is going to play before it transposes and so forth. So this is saying pattern 01 is going to play for 2 bars and then go to pattern A2. Then you turn this encoder and you get to pattern 2, which is the transposed one. It's going to play for 2 bars. Then it's going to loop to A1 and repeat to infinity. So now making sure that I have the playlist turned on again, gonna take a look at these 2 playing. 2, 3, 4, then back again. And those 2 are just gonna cycle. Now I said that pattern 2 is different. So let's make it different. So I'm going to go and select it like that. And we're taking a look at part 1, A2, this time the one that's transposed. And let's get that different rhythm on the second part. So I think that's got it, just by eliminating that one step. So those will just continue to go back and forth as the song goes. Now you notice that every time I stop it and start the sequence again, it returns to step 1. Now you can set up that behavior under global if that's the way you want it to operate. If you want it to you want to stop it and it just stops and stays where you are if you're working on something, that can also be chosen under global. So you hit global and then you turn this encoder here and you'll see on stop behavior, what it's going to do. Now let's work on part 2, the melody. And so we hit part and then one of the white buttons here below, of course, if we're in the select mode. You can tell which mode you are. It says right up here on the screen. You then skip mode, solo mode, mute mode, select mode, and I'll hit 2. Now I'm in part 2, gonna work on the pitch of it, and it's E flat, but an octave up. And for this, I'm using Atlantis voice, and I'll do it the same way. I'll have a little preset there. Where it's just jumping back and forth. Now you notice that I'm hitting previous and next here to get to, the first 8 steps, the second 8 steps. But if you want like a chasing behavior where it plays the first, you can see the LEDs play across, and then it pops to your next steps visual on the screen. So if I hit Q and hold it down and click the encoder here, now you see that it's chasing. It's playing 8, then the screen is flipping to 9 through 16. Now let's get an 808 track going. There are a couple of different ways that the Vector can play your drum machine. One way is you can convert tracks 5 through 8 into a drum playing track where you have 4 different drum sounds per track. And with the 880, you can use this 881 unit here to run gate signals into the 880 and play the drums that way. And so you would run gate signals out of a jack expander here. Or you can use MIDI, and by means of a single TRS cable into a MIDI cable and going into the 880, use the 880 for its internal drums. And then the third way would be to use the Vector to start and sync patterns that you had previously made in the 880's internal sequencer. So starting with the last one I talked about, where you're just going to start and stop and sync patterns that are already in the System 80 or whatever drum machine that you're using. You can set that up real easily in Global. Keep hitting Global till you get to Route. Now you can use the encoder. And here's where you'll set up the channel that you're communicating with your drum machine on. And you can see that I've got mine set to channel 1. And with the 880, you can also change the MIDI channel in there. Okay, under Global General, you turn the encoder and go to where it says MIDI 2. Now that's the output you're using to communicate with the 880, and you would turn that on. And what would happen there is every time you hit run, you would start the current pattern that's selected on the 880, and it would also be in sync with the tempo of the Vector. I'm not going to use that option, so I'm going to turn that off, because every time I run this, all I want it to do is just play different sounds out of the 880. I want to be on part 5, and you have to convert that into the type of drum track that allows you to play 4 different drum sounds per track. And you do that under Global. Under Parts, you can set the type of part it will be. And by part, it sort of means tracks, as I explained before. So we're talking about part 5 here is going to be the first drum track. And you can set the type there. You can have it be mono, which is like playing notes, chord, and I'll get into that later, or a drum track. So I've got it set to be a drum track. And so when you hit pitch on part 5 now, you see those 4 drum sounds that you have there. And just by turning the encoders up, then you turn those sounds on. If your drum machine's velocity sensitive, by continuing to turn these, you can get an accent over certain points. See that? Now here is another issue with this. It's what note is playing out of these drum triggers. And that would be under Control. And if you go to the 5th control page, I guess it is, you see the voice and the note it's going to play. And you can name it different things. The first one I'm calling a bass drum. And it's note 0. And the 880 starts with the bass drum at 0 and then goes up. So snare drums 1, and then the toms and so forth. It looks like 10 is a closed hat. cowbell, clap, rim tap. Now I got the drums in there. Let me turn up the bass line. And turn up the melody. Now for the TB303 track, I'm out of pitch and gate on the front panel of the Vector. So now I'm going to the jack expander, and it has 4 more pitch and gates plus 4 velocities and 8 triggers. I'm going to use pitch and gate number 3. And so if I go to part 3, I've entered in the pitches, and if you hit pitch again, you can see glide, and really that's not a TB303 glide. It just glides from whatever step you're on to the next step, and that's not really how the TB303 necessarily works. If you add slide on the TB303, the first thing it does is gate the 2 steps so that you have a solid sound in between. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit gate here and make sure that I've gated some of these steps in between. But it's more important for the Acidlab M303 to put an input into the slide in input of that module, which is what I'm going to do. So for here, I'm just allowing the note to be gated out for a few steps. And this is what I got. And then to add that input into the slide, I'm going to use a trigger. So I use trigger number 4, and that's routed to part 4. And if you look at the gates, I've got gates on 3 and 4. So I'll get it going, and then I'll plug in the voltage into the slide in of the M303. Now plugging it in. So while I'm on the TB303 acid line, I want to show you something here. If you go under the 3rd page of control, it can generate an acid line for you and evolve the one you've got. So evolved it quite a bit. Let me generate one. And now to finish this up, let's run a chord into the Knobula, get a little pad sound going. So as I said before, you have to designate a part to be a chord part if you want to do chords on it, just like you have to designate it to be a drum part to do that. So I'll go to global, to parts, I'll go to part 7, and here's where I can change it to a chord track. I'm going to play the Poly Cinematic using the MIDI out of the jack expander here, and Poly Cinematic provides you with this chord here in a beautiful turquoise blue. And so to set that up so that this jack is outputting the MIDI from part 7, global until you get to routing, and then you'll turn this main encoder here till you get to the jack expander MIDI, as it says there, and you'll set that to part 7. Now notice this helpful gray text here. It says shift twist for channel. So what it's saying is if you want to change this MIDI channel that you're communicating on, then you hold shift and twist this encoder here, and then you can change the MIDI channel. Well, I'm going to communicate. I was communicating with 880 drum machine on channel 1, so I don't want all those messages going into my Poly Cinematic and messing up the chord. So I'm going to change that channel to channel 2, and then in the Poly Cinematic it allows you to change the MIDI channel as well. So I've got the Poly Cinematic set on MIDI channel 2. I'm going to work with this second chord here so that I don't mess up what I've done, but you can see there's a cursor there out to the left of the C, and if you turn the main encoder, you move it over to the right. Now you're able to change your second note by semitones. So let's go 3 semitones and turn this down and listen to it. That's the chord we have. You could go and do a 5th. And there are preset chords in there, such as major chord, minor, and even major 7. For house, chord minor 7. All right, so you select the first semitone you want. So I'll go 3 up, then I'll hold the edit button, and it moves that 3 down. Then I'll put 5 up, and we can play it and see what we've got. Or I can do the Spyboter chord, which is going to be down. Let's do a 7 and a 10 with the bass note. So that's the Spyboter chord. So that's how the chord entry works. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial for the Vector, and a look at some of the other modules as well and how I'm using them. There are several more hours of Vector video I have to edit because I only just touched on it to allow a beginner to hit the ground running. But I didn't even get into the arpeggiator and some of the newer features in the Vector. I'll have to save that for another day. Please check out my Patreon for downloads of many live sets and patches for a lot of your favorite synths and VSTs, covering sounds of Boards of Canada, AFX Twin, Lone, Classic House. But more than that, become a patron if you like what I'm doing. Support what you like. All right, see you next time.